Hey, this is Dr. Syed Hyder with the Dr. Hyder Show. We have a great guest today. Her name is Tiffany Parotto. I hope I'm saying her name right. I should have checked before, but she'll correct me if I'm wrong. She's the founder of MyCycleStory.com, an important initiative to document and publish research on hormonal disruptions, fertility, and cycle changes in women. And she's taking a lead in this research into reproductive toxicity, which should have been really demanded by the FDA from Big Pharma from the very outset before any shots went into arms. Anyway, we'll get into all of that and what she's doing exactly. But just to give her a little bit of intro, her background, she's a strategy and communications consultant. She's recently worked with Millions Against Medical Mandates, a national coalition of health freedom activists working to prevent medical mandates and promote health choice and education. And that's where she launched the MyCycleStory initiative. You can find that at MyCycleStory.com. And along with her career as a seasoned marketing and communications leader in corporate America, she's also spent nearly a decade working as a board member with health freedom organizations like Health Freedom Florida and CHD Florida. She's also worked with Stand for Health Freedom and Vaxxed, along with many other leaders and activist groups. As an innovation and program design storyteller, she focuses her work on understanding the societal and cultural impacts of media and messaging, and she's worked on the development of grassroots initiatives, digital campaigns, virtual and in-person events, legislative efforts, digital campaigns. I think I'm repeating myself, global campaigns and movements and content development. She has a marketing communications degree from Western Illinois University and currently lives in Florida with her two children. So without further ado, I'm taking up like half the interview. I'd like to welcome Tiffany. And how do you say your last name?
It's Parado. You said it right.
Parotto. Okay, great. All right, wonderful. So I'd like to start maybe with just tell us like what you were doing maybe back in the beginning and how you got into this, what you're doing now. How did you get into it?
My whole backstory. Yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe in a nutshell, like,
Yeah.
like kind of like what maybe woke you up to a problem,
Yeah.
with, basically
Yeah.
back in the, a couple of years ago when all of this started. Did something, trigger you to think that, hey, there's something here that we need to look more into, or was it really after the shots started coming out?
Yeah. Well, it's been about a decade now. So before I even had children, a friend of mine actually gave her daughter the MMR vaccine, and after actually a series of shots, her daughter kind of lost the ability to really connect with her again. And fast forward 10 years later, she's still wheelchair bound and nonverbal. And so when I became pregnant, she just said, Tiffany, I don't think everything is what it seems. I'm not telling you not to do something, but I think everything is worth looking into, especially
Mm-hmm.
vaccines. And so that kind of started my journey of diving into really understanding the science a little bit. And I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor. I just took a look at all the data that we have at our fingertips, and I weighed out the risk versus benefit analysis for my own self and my family. And I discovered really quickly that a lot of this stuff is being completely manipulated from a messaging perspective of the dangers of vaccines specifically. And it was very easy for me to decide that it just was not worth the risk to consider vaccines at all, especially when you take a look at the diseases themselves they're supposed to prevent. It's not a very compelling story when you really get into it. So with that, I found myself as a communicator feeling really comfortable helping people do their own research and look at things from a little bit of a different perspective. So I have two girls, neither of them are vaccinated. They're both doing extremely well. And so I really liked being able to share that story of kind of showing people it's okay, you don't have to do this. And so through this journey, I met a lot of really great people, and I started helping people understand the science a little bit through social media, and then ultimately started volunteering for different groups. I helped out with the Vaxxed team when they first got the bus tour and got the film out, and that really was my first opportunity of getting my boots on the ground and connecting with people in real life. And so through that journey, fast forward, I've worked with a ton of different groups, as you mentioned in my intro, and it's allowed me to really connect with some incredible scientists, doctors, thought leaders, et cetera, which gives me the opportunity to pay attention to what's going on in the world and ask questions, which I think people are beginning to be afraid of doing. So I've been fighting this conversation, I guess, for a long time. And then when COVID hit, we all knew that this was going to come to a vaccine conversation. We knew it. And so Then, of course, they came out with the vaccine, and we're paying attention to what's going on as the vaccine is being distributed. And we started to recognize that women were having menstrual related issues after getting the vaccine. And so we were paying attention to that conversation from the beginning. But then all of a sudden, on social media, actually, a friend of mine was having menstrual issues and she didn't get the vaccine. And so we started talking about that on socials, and knowing as many people as I do, working with Millions Against Medical Mandates, I asked some of the doctors, I said, is it possible that this vaccine could be shedding? Like, how are women who haven't even gotten vaccinated showing symptoms? What's going on here? And they said, there's a lot we need to unpack here. And I realized really quickly that we needed to talk about it. And so basically, I went and I did a few Instagram lives, and this conversation around women seeing really traumatic issues with their menstrual cycles exploded immediately on social media. It was like, it's one of those things that people don't talk about too often, but suddenly they realize that they're not the only one who's going through something weird. And so then the stories started flowing and the messages started coming. There were Facebook groups created, support groups, Telegram groups, Instagram, just stories and stories and stories of really horrible things happening to women, vaccinated and unvaccinated. And then all of a sudden, they started deleting them. So they deleted the accounts for the people who were sharing the stories, and they deleted all of the support groups. There was a Facebook group that got to, I think, last time I saw it, it was 21,000 women joined a Facebook group over the course of just a few weeks, and they deleted it. And so for me, as you mentioned, I guess in my intro, I pay attention to what's going on in society. The conversation is what I think is most important, because that's how I helped guide people through my own personal journey and their journeys. And I knew that not only is that a serious problem, that you're literally silencing women in 2021, but also that something very serious is going on. And if these anecdotal stories are just getting erased, then how can we prove that that's even happening? And so that's when I came together with my team over at MAM, and I said, we have to do something about this. We have to take these stories and we have to somehow turn them into data, because if it's data and we can publish this research, that's not something that they can delete, right? Censorship is such a huge problem. We can't allow these women to fall on deaf ears. We are not going to allow to rip the throats out of tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of women who are experiencing really crazy things. And so that's why we created the MyCycleStory survey and just published the first paper.
So you mentioned a few times in there the severity of the effects for some women. Can you just touch on that? Like, what are some of the worst things that you're seeing? I mean, not just maybe cycle disruptions, but how does it get beyond that? How does it get worse than that?
Yeah, and actually it's interesting because the cycle disruptions are what we're hearing about least often. People are coming to the table because the experiences they're having are so traumatic. And so some of the biggest things that we see most often in the testimonies that I was receiving photos, is major clotting, which obviously is going to ring a bell in many of the conversations that we're hearing related to this vaccine. But what we were seeing were clots the size of softballs coming out of women. They don't know how to handle it. Obviously, it's extremely traumatic. So lots of clotting, heavy bleeding. I know people personally who bled for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, nonstop, to the point where they're like, I'm the walking dead. I don't know how I have blood left in my body because of how much blood I've lost. And it was really, really scary. It's very scary. So we had tons of heavy bleeding, clotting, lots of abdominal pain, missing periods entirely without testing positive for pregnancy. Obviously, a ton of traumatic miscarriages and decidual cast shedding, which is the shedding of the entire lining of your uterus. So these masses are coming out of women. And the stories, our survey is 18 and over, but we were also getting stories of girls as young as 2 years old beginning to bleed or passing clots. And a friend of mine I know personally experienced that with one of her patients. And so really scary stuff. And then some of the more bizarre things is Postmenopausal women started bleeding again, heavy bleeding, clotting, experiencing things like they had a full period again decades after having it. And women as old as, I think we had one that was 92 years old bleeding. And so obviously there's something very serious going on. And
Yeah, so one question I have, I guess, is that in a country of, hundreds of millions of people, you're always going to have these like edge cases or unusual cases in medicine that get written up. And so there's always going to be some baseline rate of something unusual happening to somebody somewhere. So do you have a sense that there was a certain baseline rate of these irregularities, due to, whatever else, was going on
right.
before this pandemic, and that we've exceeded that baseline rate now? Do you have some sense that we have exceeded it at this point?
Yeah, it's been really interesting digging into all of this because there's many reasons that women's cycles can be disrupted. And what we were hearing most from the testimonies and the people that were communicating with us through this experience is that their doctor was saying, okay, that could be normal. It could be because of stress, because of COVID. It could be because you're not getting enough sleep, because because of the birth control you're on, right? So there's all these reasons that can disrupt cycles. But at the end of the day, the disruptions are typically pretty, I don't want to say mild, oftentimes like longer period, shorter period, missed period. That's all possible. Spotting in between periods. Those are the common things you hear about most. We were getting bombarded with extremely severe symptoms. And to give an example, the paper we just published focused on an issue that is so rare that there is only 44 cases documented in any of the medical journals over the last 119
Oh my God.
years.
Wow. Tell us about
And
that.
and we had 6,200 people complete this survey, and we had 292 instances of decidual cash shedding.
Wow.
So from our perspective, and every OBGYN that I've spoken to, most of them have never even seen this phenomenon in their entire practice
Mm.
existence, anything. And here we are getting flooded with women who have no idea what's going on with them, suddenly knowing that, oh my gosh, my parts of my uterus are falling out. It's terrifying. And what's interesting is this, it absolutely feels like a spike, right? It's the spring after the COVID vaccine has been distributed. And now all of a sudden, this is something that people are talking about. That's because all of a sudden it's happening to this at the same time to these people. So, what else could it be?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that's occurred to me is that maybe you have acute effects of COVID and you have longer term effects of COVID. Some people, might, or from the vaccines also, right? You're going to have acute and chronic effects of injections. But you're talking to women who have maybe had COVID or not had COVID, or maybe been injected or not injected. I mean, are you seeing a spectrum, like all across the spectrum of women coming in with unusual symptoms?
Yeah, and it's interesting because we're trying to dig a little bit deeper into whether or not just exposure to the spike protein could be causing this. And that can come in a number of ways, right? Obviously, getting the vaccine, but also getting COVID or thinking you have COVID, maybe even didn't get a positive test, but feel like you have the COVID symptoms. And then also being in close proximity to people who've been recently vaccinated. Believe it or not, the majority of the stories that we got in, which is really what started that conversation on social media, were people that were very close to people who were recently vaccinated and noticed symptoms immediately after. I'm
Mm.
talking, I went to dinner with my friends, I came home, started cramping, bleeding, and hemorrhaging. And we have hundreds of these, thousands of these stories where women experienced things like that. So we're trying to take a look at it. It's really interesting to try to figure out what could be the actual cause of it, but we're paying very close attention to what the reactions of people who were being vaccinated versus the people who shared a bed with someone who was vaccinated versus people who don't go around the vaccinated people at all, or they just had COVID. So we're looking at all of it to try to figure out how we can get to the bottom of this. But ultimately, our goal is to just bring to the attention that something very serious is happening, and we need to do something about it. We have to pay attention to it, and a marketer off the street should not be the one investigating what's going on. Or
Yeah, I think that's such an important point that, first of all, the FDA should have insisted on, all kinds of studies that they didn't insist on. And then second of all, even after that, I mean, there's, thousands of, or maybe hundreds of thousands of scientists around the world who should really be looking into this. I mean, even in the initial trials themselves, they were warning of being around pregnant women, for example. And so they were kind of like hinting at the fact that, shedding is a possibility here. Are you aware? Has anyone even like looked into the idea of shedding as a possibility, like finding the mechanistic explanation for these symptoms? I mean, is spike protein coming out in your breath or your sweat or your bodily fluids? Has anyone actually even looked?
It's really interesting. I know that there's been a few doctors that have looked into the mechanisms of potential shedding that could come from the COVID vaccine, but it almost feels too easy. And we're looking around, all you have to do is pull droplets and see if the spike protein is in those droplets.
Right.
And that research is not being done. And, I'm calling everybody I know to try to see who has the capability of doing something like that. But at the end of the day, we know who should be doing it. And it should be the government. They should have done that from the beginning, the NIH, all of them. They should have figured out if this was a possibility. And at the end of the day, they may have, right? And that could be
Yeah.
why
They may
they're
already
not
know
about
the
it.
answer. Or
Yeah.
yeah, oftentimes they don't ask the question that they don't want the answer to,
Mhm.
or they do have the answer and they're just not showing, the rest of the world that answer. So, have you tried to approach researchers or scientists? I mean, have you gotten in touch or been in, put in touch with people and met a brick wall or met like a refusal or even started a conversation with anyone who might be able to help you with this?
We're digging and asking. It's really just trying to find the people that have the resources. And it's harder than you would think to get in contact with those people because they work for the institutions that don't really care to hear about what we have to say. I'm lucky that I am connected with a ton of really incredible researchers, statisticians, doctors, OBGYNs, and we're doing as much data research as we can to try to figure these things out, but we only have so many resources at our fingertips. And so there is probably a lot of information out there that would be really valuable to look into that could tell a very, very interesting story like that. For example, period apps. A lot of women keep apps on their phone and they track their periods, they track their
Hmm.
pregnancy, they put their symptoms in. At the flip of a hat, that data could be available for that investigation to see if there's something happening. But at the end of the day, that's not what they're doing with it. However, they are keeping it, they're just not doing that with it.
Yeah, I think maybe what people don't realize is that the money spigot, right? Like who benefits, and so the money either comes from the government or from big pharma, and if both of these groups are kind of intertwined and they have like they have a lot of the government is captured basically, and so neither the government nor big pharma wants to fund this research. So where do you get the funding for it? And so
Exactly.
researchers can't, these things cost a lot of money obviously to even run lab tests on sweat and look for the spike protein. I mean, you just don't have access to funds. So I mean, I think at the end of the day we need to either crowdsource the funding, for
Yeah.
some kind of independent researcher, and then you got to find somebody who's willing to like torpedo their career, right? Because
Yeah,
after this
that's right.
they may not be able to go back to academia, or so I know that there are initiatives. I mean, it's just in its infancy, so it just kind of highlights the fact again that we need to create our own
That's
separate
right.
system, right? That's
Yeah.
parallel, running in parallel to
Yeah.
this corrupt, horrible system out there. And so so there are things like there's initiatives to start, new hospitals, new clinics, and new universities, even like the University of Austin. I think Joe or John Lonsdale, I think it's Joe Lonsdale, he's funding that. And it's going to be, basically a full-on university, right? So a place like that is built from the ground up, to enshrine the importance of freedom of speech, especially for professors and
Yeah.
students. So hopefully, at some point we'll have funding for stuff like this. But I think in the meantime, have you looked into maybe crowdfunding it or,
Yeah, we have,
approaching it that
and
way?
we've started actually having discussions around that as we understand what it's going to take to get more information around it. Because we do have a lot of data with the survey that we put out initially, but Obviously, to dig deeper, you need more information from a larger data set of people that's really exceptionally balanced. Unfortunately, with our research, we are only communicating, we only have information from people experiencing symptoms. So we don't necessarily have that control of the people who are not experiencing any issues. So understanding that balance is something that we're trying to figure out how to do. And it's interesting that you say that about the institutions, because the whole reason we created MyCycleStory is when the conversation started, there was the University of Chicago, a professor there created a survey because she herself was having menstrual issues after receiving the COVID vaccine. When we started talking about this, I took the survey myself that she was putting out there, of course, sponsored by the University of Chicago, and it didn't touch on any of the issues that I was seeing. It blew my mind. Actually, it was offensive because it was not only was it testimonial based, so it was all open form responses. Right. So you don't really get a whole lot of data out of that, but it didn't even ask the right questions. So it was telling you to describe, like the yes or no questions were, do you feel more creative? Are you feeling more depressed than usual? And it did not mention, it asked if your period was longer or shorter, but it did not talk about any miscarriages, any blood clotting. It did not talk about anything that I was seeing from women. So people go, they bum rush. She got, I think, over 20,000 submissions to that study, but it didn't tell the story. And I know that because of her study, that helped with the government funding the NIH, I think $1.8 million to investigate this issue, which ultimately came to the conclusion that, oh, your period may be an extra 2 days. I think that was the average, right? The average effects are extended period for a day or two, but it should balance right back out. Well, you're not asking the right questions. And you're not, and actually that doctor from University of Chicago isn't even getting any of that funding for her own research. So not only was the survey not set up properly to tell us any kind of story, but it's leading to money being put into investigating the issue with no independent parties. It's the same people telling us everything is okay that are funding the distribution of the vaccine itself. So how are we supposed to actually know what's going on? And so that's really why we created MyCycleStory, because it didn't, we needed to get into the details of what was really happening. And so we're the only ones doing that. But hopefully we can continue to do it and build this story out so that we can really gain some attention, As a marketer, I think it's important that this information gets out so that people recognize it's happening, so that they know when it's happening to them that it's not normal. And so ultimately that's it.
Yeah. Have you started to get a sense after all these submissions and going through them whether there's kind of a dose response relationships in terms of severity, like the people who are vaccinated have a worse time of it, or does it just seem like kind of random? And also the people who, part two of the question, the people who have not been vaccinated, or maybe haven't had COVID, and they experience these symptoms when they're around somebody who's vaccinated, does it always wear off within a few days or hours? Is it reversible?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, it's interesting that you asked that, because we've been looking into and trying to categorize the symptoms based on severity. Well, you talk to one OBGYN and they say if you're a woman, you know your body, right? And you know what's expected. And when something changes, especially dramatically, it's severe. If you miss a period, that could be considered severe. If you've had a period every single month, every 28 days for 30 years, that is severe missing a period, right? So we've been actually looking at the literature and trying to discover how we can categorize these symptoms. And, it's hard to say. And so obviously we have to categorize the symptoms in some way and then take a look at the experiences and what their exposure to spike protein looks like. And right now we're trying to build those pieces together, because we're finding that a lot of our symptoms are lumping together as bleeding related, obviously, like clotting, heavy bleeding, excessive bleeding, or bleeding for long periods of time. Those are obviously categorized together. And it doesn't seem to be discriminating people who were vaccinated or someone who is sleeping with someone who is vaccinated. However, we do see that in the testimony, these symptoms begin to happen immediately after being around someone who has been recently vaccinated. So it's hard to actually take that information and turn it into data to paint a true picture. And then to answer your second question, does it go away right away? Sometimes, but like I said, I know people personally who bled for 4 months straight to the point where they couldn't even, function day to day because they just can't hold, like they're bleeding through diapers. And so I think some people get it worse than others, and then some people get it reoccurring every time they go out. From my personal perspective, not scientifically, I think that every person responds differently to all of these things. And some people are way more sensitive to feeling the reaction, which I believe could be that spike protein and experiencing those symptoms. And then some people just have a lot tougher time with it and some people don't.
Yeah, I think one of the things that if we do get funding, if you or somebody gets funding and starts to look at this, would be to check whether it is the spike protein or whether it's something like the lipid nanoparticles that are somehow passing out, and because we already know that those go into the ovaries and could cause inflammation. Um, so have these women, or has the survey been structured in such a way to ask them if they've tried anything, like for example some off-label medications? Has anyone that have found those to be of benefit to maybe prevent the symptoms from happening when they're exposed to other people, or to help minimize the symptoms or get over them?
Yeah, it's interesting because that was one of the questions we got asked most often. When people come to us and they're having issues, they say, "What can I do about it? I need this to stop." And uh, we found actually that COVID treatment helps support it, and things like pine needle tea, like organic solutions, believe it or not, seem to help to some degree. But for some people, there's nothing. They just have to wait it out, and time is the answer. And so yeah, I think that some people are taking ivermectin and things like that to help with symptoms, but ultimately it's tough. It's hard to say what really works.
Can you when you said organic solutions, do you mean getting rid of like things that are non-organic in your life, like food?
Well, more like holistic supplements and
I
things,
see. I see.
right?
Yeah.
So like things like pine needle tea were said to work really well, believe it or
Mm.
not, with um, the things that are meant to help regulate the female system in nature, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. So tell us just a little bit about what the we've been kind of dancing around it, but like what was the research that you did? What kind of data did you collect, and what were your results so far? It sounds like you published something already, and are you working on something beyond that? Another one, some more data collection going forward?
Yeah, so we were able to obtain about 6,200 respondents from the year 2021. So we had more than 7,000 people submit, but we wanted the really tidy data so that we could get in and investigate it. And we asked every question under the sun because after seeing that University of Chicago survey, I wanted to make sure that we didn't leave any stone unturned as to what else could have been causing this. So when we put the survey together, it was extremely robust. We worked with OBGYNs to ask the tough questions. And then we talked about what lifestyles they had, what kind of diet are they on, what's
Wow.
their nationality, what color are their eyes, what's their blood type, what supplements are you taking, what medications are you taking, are you on birth control, what kind of birth control, when
Mm.
was your first period, when was your last period, how many children. I mean, we asked everything. Your level of stress, do you smoke or do recreational drugs? It was a full scope of the person's general health as they were completing this survey so that we could take a look at the data and understand if there was something in common outside of COVID or the vaccine
Mm.
that could have been causing this. And so that's when we started digging into the data and the symptoms we were seeing, these huge red flags around decidual cash shedding stood out. And I mentioned that there are 44 recorded cases in 119 years of historical science, and we had 292. So we kept seeing these come in, and we said, before we do anything, we need to address this issue right now, because this is absolutely insane. And so the first paper that we just published a few weeks ago, on April 14th, which actually was almost the exact year of when this conversation started, and we started doing MyCycleStory, was specifically around decidual cast shedding and bringing to light this issue that was happening. And so we just needed to get this information out there. And what we did in this paper was take a look at the typical issues that women have period problems for. And they're things like high levels of stress and hormonal birth control and lack of sleep. And I actually have a few things right here, their age. So just to give you an idea, we asked them what their general stress level was, and we have over mild, low to none to moderate is about 85% of our respondents.
Wow.
People that responded in our surveys that were positive for decidual cast shedding, 88.6% of them said that their periods were very regularly occurring, right? So this is not something that is common for them. Their typical menstrual length was average. Their typical flow was 69.9% said light. And here they are losing masses of tissue and bleeding excessively. 17% were trying to conceive. And actually, we had a very, very low rate of hormonal contraceptive, which is something that historically has been connected with decidual cast shedding. So this paper specifically said decidual cast shedding is happening at astronomical rates. It's a very severe, uncomfortable, and terrifying experience for these women that otherwise don't have, in general, the reasons that you may see this happen. And so that's the first paper that we put together. And that was published in the Gazette of Medical Sciences in April. And so now, as we dig into this, there's a few things that we're really trying to focus on. I mentioned earlier that there was an excessive number of postmenopausal women who were bleeding. And we find that very interesting. And so we're digging in and trying to investigate why that might be happening. And then also this shedding question, right? Taking a really close look at the proximity questions we ask. We ask people if they share a bed and are intimate with someone who is vaccinated, or if they don't go out very much and they never see people, so that we can understand if there is some connection between the women who were not vaccinated and the proximity of being around people who were, to see if we can try to bring any light to this shedding conversation or not. And then, of course, the vaccinated versus unvaccinated. And this is why we need to acquire more data so that we can really get a good picture of what's happening in the vaccinated population and the unvaccinated population on a larger scale, so that we can see if there is significant reactions happening in those who've gotten the shot versus not, versus proximity. So we are outlining several ways that we can do some consumer-based research, possibly to get a look at creating those averages and building those controls so that we can dig deeper and get some of these questions answered.
So, with the data that you've collected so far, is there any signal there, in terms of something that might make you more prone to present with these problems? Perhaps, like, are most of them vaccinated, or most of them unvaccinated? Are most of them? I mean, is there a signal in that, to answer that question? Is it primarily vaxxed or unvaxxed, or is it pretty 50-50? I mean, is it all
Well,
across
it's
the board?
hard to say. So when we created the survey, it really was specifically around this conversation of shedding.
Mm,
And so through crowdsourcing is how we received all the submissions for the survey. And the women who recognized and discovered and came upon the survey to complete it, a lot of them were not vaccinated and experiencing symptoms, and that's what was
mm,
peculiar to them. So a
right.
large percentage of our submissions to this survey are not vaccinated, which is good because it helps us understand what could be happening there. But
Sure.
we really want to really balance the vaccinated community as well, and then also get a peek into the people who are not experiencing symptoms on both ends of that spectrum, so that we can get a true picture of what's possibly happening and how severe it could be worse or better for either
Yeah.
population.
Makes sense. So it sounds like you've been working pretty closely with some OBGYNs. How much concern is there amongst these, professionals, physicians, and patients about, fertility issues now or into the future? And are we already seeing signs of some change in our population's fertility, as far as you know?
Well, I do know that there's a huge concern with it. That's why, we have several OBGYNs on our team digging into this. And this decidual cash shedding, for example, something they've never seen before. Suddenly we're getting pictures because everyone's talking about it because they're seeing it in their office. They're
Mm,
busier than they've ever been because people are having issues. And so when you talk to OBGYNs, I can't imagine how they can't see that something is happening. What and it's extremely concerning to them. And I know that even Dr. Jim Thorpe, who is on our team, he's OBGYN, he's been
mm,
digging into the research around miscarriages, and miscarriages are up 800%. And we know that miscarriages have been on the rise for a number of reasons, but to see such a dramatic spike is actually terrifying. And there is no doubt that this is going to cause major effects on fertility and the ability for people to get pregnant. What's fascinating to me is that we even made it this far with them telling us that we had nothing to worry about. You can't even
yeah.
have a child in that time frame, get pregnant and have a child in the time frame that it took them to do their research with this. And so I think that, there's a huge concern. They're seeing issues and the numbers are not lying.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm wondering if people are also seeing this in the fertility clinics. I mean, I would expect that at this point they would also be overwhelmed with
Hmm.
people. And it's doubly concerning since our population, the birth rates are already quite low. We're not even perhaps at replacement levels at this point. So if there is
Yeah.
a dramatic rise in infertility, population could plummet, and that would be terrible for any
Hmm.
country, right? And for any economy, it basically crashes the entire system. You just don't have the workers coming online, in the future, the same, the amount that you need, right? You don't have the amount of people being born to keep the everything running. So I think this is something that people aren't concerned enough about, right? Like Elon Musk recently said that he's been concerned about it for a long time, and it's not something, in the general conversation. I mean, people aren't really talking about it enough. That we're not having enough babies to really sustain modern civilization around the world, not just in any country, but almost everywhere.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting to pay attention to. I think that people are just comfortable with knowing that suddenly it's hard to get pregnant. I think probably 50% of the women that I know have difficulty getting pregnant, as if that's something that's normal. And it
Mm,
wasn't normal before, and it absolutely should not be normal now. Women who've had 3 healthy births without any issues suddenly having miscarriage, that's not normal either. There's obviously the threshold of averages, and I don't know the number specifically, but I do know that we are far beyond that threshold of what average looks like and how these things can happen. And there's absolutely going to be major effects for that. The fact of the matter is, if people want to grow their family and have babies, they should be able to do that because we were given our bodies to function, and we are not broken. We're just doing something that is breaking us, and we need to continue to investigate what that could be and try to eliminate those things from our lives so that we are in a position to be able to have control over how we want our population to grow by choosing to have children.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point that you made there about people just assuming that it's normal, right? It's like the frog getting boiled in the water slowly.
Yeah,
We look
exactly.
around us and, we have relatively short lives, if you look at things from a broader perspective, 80 years, maybe less. And so, we don't remember, we don't know, what things were like for our grandparents. And if our scientists and our doctors are not allowed, and our media, it just puts a clamp on everything, all this information, and doesn't allow it to get out. People just won't know that this is
Yep.
not normal. Right? Like they'll just assume that what I'm experiencing is just the way it's always been. It's always been hard to have a baby. and it's really not. And so I think just that information itself, that there is a huge change now, and there's something very, very wrong. And
Mhm.
like you said, I mean, things have been worsening probably for decades, with all the chemicals that get spewed into our
Yep.
environment. But to have such a dramatic worsening in just 1 year, is just unbelievable. And if you extend that, trend out, this could be like a end of a civilization, right? I mean, you're talking
It's
about
terrifying.
it could be the
I
end of
know
humanity.
that's right. And there's a lot of things that have touched on fertility. And I know there's a documentary coming out that's going to address what happened in Africa when they were testing out drugs on, the African women, and it caused complete infertility in them. What's to say that there aren't chemicals in these vaccines that could be doing the same exact thing? And so we have to pay attention to it, and we have to communicate it, because people need to know that if they want to grow their family, they need to consider what they're putting in their body today to know whether or not they're going to have a good time, like an easy time of doing that or not.
Yeah, definitely.
Mhm.
So I think it's also important, obviously we need research being done on how to mitigate, right, the effects. And so I think it would be important to keep gathering
Mhm.
the data, on what people are doing and finding works, right? What they're
Yep.
finding helps them,
Yep.
either, because some people just can't avoid being around people who've been vaccinated, right? I
Right.
mean, some
Yeah.
people just have to go to work. Some people have them in their house, and their family, people who've been vaccinated, and there's really, it's a difficult choice, but sometimes you don't feel that you have a choice, right? You're stuck
Yeah.
between a rock and a hard place. Um, so yeah, definitely a lot of important things to do. So right now, are you planning kind of like a round two, or like a second questionnaire, or something in the for the future?
Yeah, there's a lot of layers, and we're just trying to determine what to do next as fast as possible, right? Unfortunately, these things take time, especially when you're crowdsourcing for survey submissions. So we do have some partners that actually allow us to engage in consumer-based survey organizations, right? So that means that it's a blanket microcosm of the country. And so it balances things out like age and race automatically, and it's totally anonymous. And that gives us a kind of a really good picture of where things average out in comparison to the rest of the country. And so we're looking into doing something like that to get a clearer picture of symptoms between vaccinated or unvaccinated, or to get into any other details a year later, right? How their symptoms are doing, or what their effects are if they were able to get pregnant after having 4 miscarriages. I think that we need to we're continuing to look at the data that we have and pick apart those symptoms, and look into that proximity stuff, like I mentioned, because we need people to be able to understand if there's a risk there. How can we help prevent this from happening to them? And the last thing we want to do is scare people into staying in their homes because they're trying to avoid being around the vaccinated community. But at the end of the day, these are still things that we have to look into. So this first study was absolutely number one. And there's a lot of different directions that we need to go in. Obviously, we need to get funding to do big consumer surveys like the one I mentioned. So we are working on figuring out how to do that, and just trying to prioritize based on the information we have versus how much time it's going to take to get more information on other issues.
So yeah, so I have a couple of questions. I don't want to forget them. One is there a place where people can kind of contribute, to this? Is there a fund or something, or a GoFundMe? And second, maybe I've already forgotten it. Yeah, so let's start with the first question. Maybe I'll come back to the
Sure.
second one.
So the survey was initially funded through Ruth Westrich of the Westrich Foundation and Millions Against Medical Mandates. And so Millions Against Medical Mandates is still accepting contributions to help fund continued research on this issue. And so if people want to contribute to this work, they can make a donation at millionsagainstmandates.org, or mam.org, MAMM.org. And yeah, that's really.
Yeah, so the other question was, um, I keep forgetting the question. Um, Maybe I'll come back to it. I'm going to try to bring up mamm.org,
Mhm.
and show it on the screen.
Millions against mandates.
Millions against, is it MA? It's MAMM, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, there it is. All right, I'll just share that real quick.
And we're also working, we have several members of Children's Health Defense on our team as well. Oh, that's the new website. So
okay,
yeah, so the donate button's just at the top. It should be pretty easy to get through.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's great. So people can come here and donate. And right now, Millions Against Medical Mandates, is this all they're doing, or they're doing a lot of things? Can you choose to direct your donation in a certain direction?
Yeah, they're doing all sorts of things, but I think for right now, the donations are just being filtered to help with MyCycleStory. I think that they're, of course, always accepting donations, and the newsletter is amazing. Everybody should sign up for it. And they're doing a lot of incredible work. They're an amazing organization.
So the other question I had was, how do you raise awareness for this? Like, what are your in what ways are you looking to raise awareness, and like, how do you do that? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, that's funny because I am a professional marketer, right? So
Yeah,
that's
right.
really what my ultimate goal is. And I will tell you, it's a challenge these days because of censorship. And especially with this, I still feel like this menstrual issue conversation was the straw that broke the camel's back with the censorship. It seemed like when that conversation happened, they started just bringing down the hammer and eliminating and really just tightening up that algorithm to make sure that people aren't allowed to talk about it. So it's a huge challenge drawing awareness, and that's something that I really feel I need to continue to figure out how to do, because at the end of the day, we have to recognize that we need to communicate with everybody in our circle about what's going on with us, because it's going to come back to just general feet on the ground community awareness. I think that's really going to create real change. What I recognize from the MyCycleStory experience or things like the trucker convoy is that when things are happening to people and it directly affects them or connects with them, there's nothing more important than finding other people that are experiencing something similar. Otherwise, you're just quietly sitting by yourself and you don't know that you're not the only one having it. And so because of that, we have to give people permission and confidence to start having conversations again. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to play a role in making sure that awareness happens. But I think that every individual needs to take responsibility of their opinions, and you don't have to be a doctor or a scientist to have a conversation about things that don't feel right with you or that you heard about happening, because you're not going to get it from the news anymore. It's very hard to navigate and find it through social media. So we have to just take it back to traditional grassroots conversations with everyone you know. And you'll find that you are not alone. And, just like this menstrual stuff, I knew more people that were experiencing issues with their period. I would say 50% of my female friends were having issues. At my office, there's 7 women, 5 of the women were having menstrual issues. So you just start the conversation and you realize, oh my gosh, this is so much bigger than maybe the number of people in your circle who have had severe complications with COVID, for example, right? So the right conversations need to be had, and we need to, have the courage to have them. And that's how you build awareness. And then finding people like you who are continuing to tell the story. You got to get off the typical media outlets and into the weeds of independent journalists. And you don't have to believe everything they say to absorb information and make decisions for yourself and share what you're learning. And so really awareness is sharing your experiences, sharing what you hear, and then finding people that are not bought and considering what they're saying. Just take it in. And so, it's a challenge, but we have to put the research out so that this data exists and it's not just an idea or a testimony that people can, pretend didn't actually happen, and just keep talking about it.
So right now, this is the website where you
Mhm.
have the information, but there's not right now. You can still take the survey. You're
Yeah,
still
the survey
collecting the
is
data.
still open. We've kept it open. So the paper that we just put out was all the data that we collected through the year 2021. But things are still happening and we are still getting survey submissions. And so we want to continue to grow our data set, especially with people who have been vaccinated that are now discovering this survey, especially with people who are not experiencing issues. We want them to complete the survey as well. So if you're a female and you're over the age of 18, regardless of your situation, we want to see more data.
Yeah, that's excellent. Um, so the other question, I guess, one other question I had was, you've gotten a lot of data and you published that one article. Are there more articles waiting in the data, like other ways to kind of analyze it, some more information
Mhm.
that you can get out of it?
Yeah, and that's what we're looking into. We absolutely have a story to tell about postmenopausal bleeding in our data. We absolutely have a story to tell about proximity and exposure to
Mm.
spike protein or whatever you want to call it. We're just peeling those pieces out now to see how we can tell the clearest and most accurate story with the information that we've been given from it. Mhm.
Yeah. So the other thing that you had mentioned was, finding so many people amongst your friend group and, at work and like whenever you ask. And so I think that's a really important thing because if you ask people, did you have like a side effect from the vaccine? They'll tell you no. But if you ask them the right question, they'll tell you yes. Right. And
Mhm.
it's because they haven't made the connection. They don't
Yep.
realize that it's a problem. So I mean, were all your kind of friends kind of on the same wavelength as you, or did you find that some people came to the realization that there was something wrong when you asked them the right questions?
Oh, absolutely. It's crazy as women how you we are kind of indoctrined to think that if there's an issue, it's one of three things, right? Stress or lack of sleep or these basic things, and so your mind immediately goes there, and making that connection can literally turn the light bulb on. I've seen the light bulb go on in so many people that I've talked to. And
Mm,
just like you said, that's exactly how the conversation goes. Oh, have you had any reactions to the vaccine? No, I was a little sore, but I felt fluish for a day, but I'm fine now. By the way, I was just diagnosed with cancer, ovarian cancer. And you're like,
yeah,
you're 36 years old. That's how do you
yeah,
think that happened? And so, there's a myriad of symptoms and issues that people are seeing since the distribution of this vaccine that don't look like vaccine reactions. And we're
yeah.
going to start to see, it's going to be very interesting to see where things are 10 years from here. And that's exactly how it happens. And the conversations need to be had just like that. Because people, the moment you connect that dot, I've seen more light bulbs go on in the past 2 years than I have in the 8 years prior trying to talk about the childhood vaccine schedule.
What do you think should happen to the people who knew what they were doing and did it anyway?
Oh man, things that I probably can't say. I just, it will be a very, it will be a very interesting day when the truth comes out, and the information is exposed at the people who were in charge and made these decisions. The worst is the knowing, right? You see these Pfizer documents coming out, and they knew that they could have issues with pregnancy, but they didn't tell us. And as it's an interesting perspective that is unfortunately all too familiar of the parents who watch their children regress after receiving vaccines. It's like this bizarre gaslighting, but knowing that it was the vaccines and knowing that the doctors knew MMR could have caused autism, and the data and the science is there, but they put it in a bucket and lit it on fire and decided not to tell you because they didn't want you to know. I can't imagine the rage and fury that is going on inside these women that have seen that happen. And I think that this is exactly how a monstrous majority of the population who was vaccinated are going to feel when we start to recognize the impact that those have on the general health and well-being of the people in the world, and how it's going to change their lives forever because of something that people knew but decided to not tell us. And that's the Nuremberg Code, right? We're just in a science experiment, and it's illegal. And so, what should happen to them? I dream about it every night. But
Yeah.
ultimately, like, it's the people who are impacted that I feel foremost, right? I just want them to wake up so that we can start healing and making better decisions, building those new paradigms, creating alternative systems. I think that that'll be honestly the greatest pain to the people who are behind all of this, is when people start discovering it, they're just going to leave their system and make everything that they've tried to create and control irrelevant. And that would be my ultimate goal of what I'd like to see.
Yeah. So I guess the purpose behind the question is that, like, I think we need to start having this conversation, um, because this may not be the last thing that these people have in store for us, right? And so the point is that if there's not a really severe consequence for something of this magnitude,
Yeah,
you're just inviting it to happen again, right? You're just laying
absolutely.
down. And I think, this was founded as a Christian country, so there are these Christian ideals, at the heart of that a lot of people have, and they've been raised with. Sometimes maybe it's less so now, but just the foundational principles, right, of turn the other cheek.
Yeah,
And I think people need to go back and re-examine that, maybe,
yeah,
and realize that you can't in some situations, right? It's fine if it's like, yourself, and somebody offends you or whatever, right? I mean, but when it's the bodies and minds and health and lives of human beings all around the world, that's a situation where you have to stand up and demand justice,
yep,
and the justice has to be swift and severe, so that the crime doesn't happen again or get worse in the future. So
yeah,
that's kind of the what I'm
yeah.
aiming at with that question.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think this is probably one of the most important and illuminating interviews I've had. I've spoken to a lot of great people, but this is one of the things that really sits at the crux of human civilization, right?
Yeah,
So the ability of women to for their reproductive systems to function properly.
yeah,
This could mean the end of human civilization if a wrench is thrown in those works, right? Like you need
right.
to um, be so careful with anything that can disrupt,
Yeah,
menstrual
every.
hormones and reproductive hormones. Um, so anyway, I'd just like to thank you. Is there anywhere else that people can go to find you? Are you on Twitter, Gab, or one of the free speech
I've
platforms?
I've been deleted off of most platforms, but I really just like to turn people to millionsagainstmandates.org for their sign up for their newsletter. They'll be up to date on all the things that I'm working on. And then if you're in the state of Florida, I'm on the board for Children's Health Defense Florida. So obviously, I work closely with both of those groups, and I think that when it comes to sharing truth and information and resources, that those are two really great places to sign up.
Awesome. All right,
And I'll
great.
be
Well,
back on social media someday, maybe when I figure out how they how to get on, because they've deleted me everywhere.
yeah, maybe after Musk finally takes over.
Yeah, maybe.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's really been
Yeah,
great.
thank
There are a lot of, comments here. I don't know, maybe we have a couple of minutes to see if there's any questions. And just a lot of people, basically thanking you and saying you're incredible and great job. So that's what I'm reading here. I think you can read them too from your end.
you.
There's a chat
That's
button
okay.
that you can click and see. Um, Yeah, so Denise TG says, anecdotally, I've heard very strange things happening with the placenta in pregnancy and even a baby being stillborn bloodless. Um, yeah, that reminds me of something that Jim Thorpe said, that he knows that ultrasonographer who can tell when you were vaccinated and with what vaccine by
Wow.
looking at the placenta, which just blew my mind, and I think Jim Thorpe is actually watching. So shout out to Jim Thorpe. Hope to have you back soon.
Amazing.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, great. So I'd love to have you back, and talk about, future developments.
Yeah,
But thank you so
absolutely.
much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for
Yeah,
coming.
thank you for having me on. Like I said before, ultimately, this conversation just needs to be had, and people need to understand. And you don't have to be a doctor or a scientist to recognize when something is wrong. And you don't have to be a thought leader or a hero to talk about it and to share it with your friends and family and the people around you. I think ultimately we just have to be brave and we have to re engage in the art form of conversation and healthy debate again. And I do believe that the world is waking up, and these instances, things like this, are what are going to reconnect people to each other and to themselves and detach them from the system that's been controlling them. And so the more we talk about it, the more impact that'll have, and we'll get through this and we'll come out on top. I know we will.
Yeah, I think just one last thought, people often feel silenced, right? And you don't have to feel that way. I think that's part of your message that, even though there's 7, 8 billion people, on planet Earth, there aren't that many degrees of separation between us and anyone else on the planet, right? Like if you tell enough people and they tell everyone they know and they tell everyone they know, like it just takes 6 or 7,
Like a
degrees.
virus.
Yeah, it can reach, it can span, it can circle the entire globe and come back to you
Sure.
very quickly within actually a few weeks. And it's just about telling everyone and telling them to tell everyone and telling them to tell everyone they tell to tell everyone. So yeah, this is how information used to spread. And like you said, it's like a virus that can spread very, very quickly. And we don't need to rely on social media or the regular media at all, right? Just
Right.
pick up the phone and or invite people over and start talking about it. So I think that is one of the most important things to take away from this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I don't know if I'm frozen on your end. You can
No,
hear
I
me.
can still see you.
Okay. So I'm looking at my frozen self. But yeah, no, exactly. So thank you so much for having me on, and I'm happy to continue the conversation. And I know people like Dr. Jim Thorpe are incredible, and he can dive into all the details and where he's seen connections. And I'm sure he'd be happy to, as well as anybody else on our team. We're here to spread the news and continue to do the research so that we can demand these answers.
Great. Thank you so much for, standing up and, giving women this voice, right? The chance to just like speak their truth out into the world instead of being silenced on social media. I think that again is so important for so many people. I mean, it's like, fine, I was harmed, but I just want to talk about it. I just want to
Yeah,
get it off my
yeah,
chest, right? And that itself is part of healing, right? It's part of
right.
just telling your story. So my cycle story, I think it's a brilliant name, and it's well chosen. So again, thank you so much, and hopefully I'll have you back soon.
Thank you. Have a good one.